youths are rising up, they're speaking out, and they want socialism. No, silly, not that kind of socialism, the nice socialism of the democratic variety. Duh.
I just want people to have health care, honey.
Socialist politicians in America want us to consider what life is like in Denmark, Sweden, and Norway.
So you're like sort of like a Scandinavian type of politician, I would say, right? Okay.
A little more brown, but yes.
Okay.
In Scandinavian countries, the government takes care of you cradle to grave. New mothers get extensive maternity leave, education and healthcare are free, and income inequality is limited. And if that wasn't enough, these countries also boast high rates of happiness and per capita GDP. So why do dirty, rotten capitalists like myself keep harping on Venezuela and the Soviet Union when a near utopian socialist society sits just next door? The internet is literally begging me to dig into the Scandinavian system, or at least a few angry people on TikTok want me to. So here it is, the video you requested, my dear friends, the Scandinavian model, aka the Nordic model, aka democratic socialism or social democracy or whatever you want to call it. My name is Maggie and welcome to Undoctrination.
Back to Sweden. Let's go.
So let's address the elephant in the room. The Scandinavian countries are not socialist.
What?
In fact, the Heritage Foundation, Fraser Institute, and other organizations that rank economic freedom have ranked them far freer than socialist economies. For example, on the Heritage Foundation's index, Venezuela ranks 174 out of 184 countries. Pretty abysmal, but Sweden, Norway, and Denmark all rank in the top 12. But you may say, with their huge welfare states, how can they not be socialist? Well, having a large welfare state doesn't exactly make a country socialist. Encyclopedia Britannica defines socialism as a system that calls for public rather than private ownership or control of property and natural resources. Socialist countries not only tax citizens and companies to fund giant welfare programs, but run entire industries themselves. The Scandinavian countries are mixed economies, as are most countries in the world, but more accurately described as mostly capitalist economies with very large welfare states. Denmark's former Prime Minister Anders Fogh Rasmussen once said, "I know that some people in the US associate the Nordic model with some sort of socialism. Therefore, I would like to make one thing clear. Denmark is far from a socialist planned economy. Denmark is a market economy." So how did this Scandinavian socialist mythology emerge? Well, it is true that these countries embraced socialist ideas in the mid to late 20th century, but before then, Scandinavian countries were wildly successful under capitalist laissez-faire economic policies. In Denmark, the Freedom of Trade and Business Act in 1856 removed restrictions on competing businesses and led to a period of rapid growth. That same year in Sweden, the Minister of Finance, Johan August Gripenstedt, promoted laissez-faire policies which transformed Sweden into one of the fastest growing economies in the world by 1890. In the following 60 years, iconic brands like IKEA and Volvo were launched. And in the century between 1870 and 1970, Sweden's per capita income grew faster than any country in the world except for Japan. In Scandinavian Unexceptionalism, Nima Sanandaji wrote, "It is very clear that many of the desirable features of Scandinavian society, such as low income inequality, low levels of poverty, and high levels of economic growth, predated the development of the welfare state. The Scandinavian countries also led the world in life expectancy by 1960. It was in the glow of capitalist successes that socialists came into power and took all of the credit."
I now have decided I own Sweden. Yeah, King of Sweden now, hello.
In their 2 decades of power in Sweden, public spending more than doubled, taxes sharply increased, and the regulatory environment became a nightmare. Johan Norberg wrote in The Mirage of Swedish Socialism, "The whole climate of ideas in Sweden was infused with socialist ideas in the 1970s and 80s, and a system of tight regulations, price controls, and tax increases rapidly centralized the economy. And these policies had a chilling effect. The country's tax burden grew to 52.3% in 1990. The growth rate went from the second highest in the world in 1970 to the second lowest in the OECD 2 decades later.
Ah! No! No!
Major companies like IKEA and Tetra left the country. Norberg wrote by 1990, the Swedish economy had not created a single net job in the private sector since 1950, even though the population had increased by 1.5 million people. At the height of the crisis, Sweden raised interest rates to 500% to cool off inflation.
100 times?
More.
200 times?
More.
500 times?
Probably.
And the Swedish people turned away from socialism. They cut regulations, price controls, and social spending, privatized previously state-run industries, and allowed for private competition in industries funded by public spending, like healthcare and education. 18% of Swedish schools and 40% of health centers are now run by private companies. Since these reforms, Sweden's wages have grown 70% after stagnating through the socialist years, and companies like Spotify and Klarna were founded. The same happened in Denmark. According to the free enterprise welfare state in the 70s, an explosion of government spending contributed to rapidly increasing wages, serious structural unemployment, relatively rapid price increases, and a balance of payments crisis. The socialists lost face during this period, and in response, the opposition enacted several austerity measures, including cuts in public spending. So the Scandinavian countries we now laud as shining examples of socialism were actually built by capitalism, and the era of socialist policies was quickly abandoned when these measures began to kill their economies. Some of these policies, however, remain today, and they make up the Nordic Model. So what is the Nordic Model? It's a framework characterized by generous public welfare. Think a large social safety net, pensions, free healthcare, and free education. And these are funded largely by high universal income taxes and sales taxes, known as VAT, which is very different from the model proposed by many democratic socialist politicians in the US, who advocate for taxing the wealthiest at the highest rates.
But it means that as you climb up this ladder, you should be contributing more.
Instead of taxes being progressive and redistributive from the highest to the lowest earners, it redistributes everyone's money across their lifespan while supporting those who can't earn themselves. Another significant difference with the US is unionization rates. Scandinavian countries have some of the world's strongest unions, which often replace government regulation with private negotiations. This makes them fairly easy places to do business, whereas the US combines complex tax structures with an even more complex regulatory web. The Scandinavians also embrace free trade, and booming business is how they fund their large welfare systems. But it's not just the model that makes the difference, it's their small, homogenous populations and high-trust society. Prior to globalization and industrialization, Scandinavian society was built on cooperation, resilience, and hard work to combat the brutal environment. And these values have been carried into a modern society of people who are built to thrive. We can see that in how they prosper even in American society. Nordic Americans' poverty rate is half that of the rest of the country, and Scandinavian immigrants have a 20% higher than average income in the US. And these values contribute to a welfare state back home that seems to be working on the surface. A 2011 study found that generous, transparent, and efficient welfare states in Scandinavian countries are based on the civicness of their citizens. But this very same welfare system is undermining many of the values built over generations. The World Values Survey found that in the 80s, only 19% of Swedes found it acceptable to falsely claim welfare benefits, but that number rose to 40% in 2011. Values like responsibility and hard work are deteriorating, and so is the working population. Birth rates are dropping everywhere in the developed world, presenting a looming problem for states with overly generous welfare programs. As populations get older, less taxpayers can support retirees in their old age. For every 100 workers in Sweden, there are 95 dependents, and in most provinces, dependents actually outnumber the workers. This is not good news for the Nordic model. Even more troubling is that the strain imposed by the welfare system can lead to a more progressive tax structure as it has in Norway, which undermines the model altogether.
You itty-bitty traitor.
In Norway, a wealth tax is chasing away the country's richest businessmen along with their companies. Fish oil tycoon Knut Erik Carlson was one of them. He said, "The wealth tax system makes it harder for companies to compete with the rest of the world. Of Norway's 400 wealthiest residents, 105 of them have either moved or transferred wealth out of the country. That means less workers and businesses to fund Norway's very large welfare state. So while the Nordic model seems to be working for now, I doubt it will work forever, unless the countries continue to liberalize and move towards more market freedom, lower taxes, and decreased welfare spending." Even still, Americans may find this system preferable to what we have: a chaotic, means-tested welfare system and progressive tax structure that penalizes you for being too successful, a regulatory system that discourages entrepreneurship, and this half-in, half-out approach to the cost of living crisis that causes prices to rise forever while the value of our dollars shrink. No wonder people are looking elsewhere for answers. But the answer is not to move towards socialism.
We have been socialists in Sweden, and we have been successful, but never at the same time.
Even the Scandinavian countries abandoned that experiment, and I'm doubtful a large welfare state with even higher taxes would work in the United States, where social trust is eroding and having a disposable income is important. Not to mention, we are a very large, very diverse country, whereas the combined population of Norway, Sweden, and Denmark is roughly the same as the greater New York City area. The Scandinavian countries discovered something in the 90s that we are not yet ready to learn. Liberalization works. Low regulations and localized negotiations are better for economic growth and worker welfare. School choice and allowing private companies to compete with public programs leads to better outcomes. And if we are to have tax and spend policies, perhaps they should be universal. In most countries that introduce socialism, you will find one of three outcomes. 1, socialism turns into dictatorship, while poverty, starvation, and shortages destroy the people, like in Venezuela. 2, the country's economy slowly and steadily declines until the situation becomes unbearable, such as in Argentina. Or 3, the country rejects the destructive outcomes of socialism and rolls it back over time. I believe that the third way is happening across Scandinavia, and we may see clearer results in next year's elections. Either way, the US can learn from these three experiments where more government intervention was not the answer. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you would like for me to dive more deeply into the specific countries we mentioned today, let me know in the comments below. I wanted to tackle this Nordic model as a whole first, but I am also a sucker for historical deep dives. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next week for another video. Ciao!